Hi, and welcome to ACE's 9th Annual Unity Conference. This is a discussion with myself and Holly Johnson about our upcoming Patient's Guide to Contaminants in Cannabis and Cannabis-Derived Products, also known as What's in Your Medicine. Give Holly a second to introduce herself.
Hey everyone, thanks so much Heather for inviting me today. So pleased to be here to talk about this great forthcoming document for patients. Again, I'm Holly Johnson. I am the Chief Science Officer for the American Herbal Products Association, and my background is in pharmacognosy and ethnobotany. I used to study indigenous medicines and ethnobotany, mostly in the South Pacific islands like Samoa and Tonga. And I've been involved with cannabis research and standard settings since about 2014. And of course, cannabis is one of our longest known ethnobotanical herbs used for food and fiber and medicine. So could not be more pleased to be involved and to be here today with Heather to talk to you guys about the new document on contaminants.
Thanks, Holly. And I am Heather Despres. I am the director of the PFC program at Americans for Safe Access. We are a recently ISO accredited program that certifies products, processes, and services. And we also do a lot of training and education courses to help educate the industry, consumers, and patients about the topics that are important to them. ASA has a lot of different resources available for patients, consumers, healthcare practitioners, and this guide is intended to follow along in those footsteps. Some of our previous publications include our Patient's Guide to Medical Cannabis, Patient's Guide to CBD. Every year, we issue a State of the States report, which breaks down the different regulations in all 50 states, plus all of the territories, and identifies ways in which states can improve their access to cannabis, especially for patients who may have limited access to it. We also issue a congressional briefing book, which will be updated for this year's new Congress. And we also have a guide on talking to your doctor about medical cannabis. The Patient's Guide to Contaminants is intended to provide an overview of the different types of contaminants that can be found in cannabis as well as hemp products. And I think that one of the things that we should really start off talking about is kind of the difference between cannabis and hemp. And as a botanical expert, Holly, I'd love it if you could explain to everyone kind of how cannabis and hemp are different, how they're the same, and kind of how we're going to be handling our discussion today.
Sure, absolutely. So, you know, obviously cannabis and hemp, it's all cannabis. It's all cannabis sativa. And one of the more interesting academic disciplines is taxonomy. And there's always this infighting among the taxonomists. But one of the more recent interpretations is that the genus cannabis is really made up of just one species. And they've done this a lot because it's one of the most hybridized species that we know of, domesticated and been in human hands for so long. So it's in some ways quite difficult to make a differentiation between cannabis and hemp. In practical terms, in the world today, the way that hemp specifically is defined, and again, this will be a US-centric definition, but there's similar definitions in other nations. But in the United States, it's now defined as plants in the species Cannabis sativa that have not more than 0.3% THC. So it's kind of interesting that there's not many other species or varietals or cultivars or really other articles that are defined solely on the basis of one single chemical constituent. That's not usually how we define taxa. But at this point, that is really what it is. They are essentially the exact same thing. And of course, there's different varieties and cultivars. There's food and fiber types that grow quite tall with their stalks. And that's maybe what's thought of as kind of the traditional industrial hemp. But these days, hemp can also be, big Christmas tree-like plants laden with inflorescence. And again, just the one defining factor for hemp is that it contains not more than 0.3% THC.
Again, I think that's really important to remember is that differentiation is really strictly for regulatory purposes. In terms of the actual plant itself, they are all the same. They just have different levels of chemical constituents, particularly delta-9 THC, because it is the psychotropic ingredient.
Heather, I'll follow up on that really quickly. You just made the best point there, is that it's really the significance is really more regulatory than scientific in many ways. And it's so related to your patient's guide to contaminants here, because as we'll get into talking about later, the different states, where high THC cannabis is regulated on a state, not a federal level, has led to this kind of patchwork of regulations and of different contaminant testing requirements. So it is largely a regulatory definition, but it has some implications for quality and for contaminants testing.
It does, and we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. But first, I want to talk about some of the contaminants that we can find and that have been found in cannabis and cannabis-derived products. And what exactly is a contaminant? A contaminant is something that's not supposed to be there. It can be anything from microbiological species, such as yeasts and molds and funguses that are not beneficial to the plant. It can be residual pesticides that may have been used to combat some of the microbiological issues. It can be residual solvents that may remain after an extraction has taken place, particularly with hydrocarbons. And it can be foreign matter, such as trellising, netting, animal droppings, rodent droppings, bird droppings, many of which are susceptible mostly to outdoor cultivation areas, and aflatoxins. And so, Holly, can you tell us a little bit about some of the more larger public health implications for what it would mean if contaminated products were to get into a patient's hands?
Yeah, absolutely. Just to follow a little bit on what you just said, this is, even though cannabis is in the state systems, many of them at least, considered a medicine, we know that on a federal level, hemp is sold as a dietary supplement to support health, not to treat or mitigate any disease. And so another distinction is to think about pharmaceutical drugs as opposed to this thing called cannabis that grows out in the wild, like all of our other herbal products, right? These things are wild, they're in nature. They do have birds and rats and things around them as they grow for the most part. So we wouldn't expect them to be as, quote, clean or free from environmental contaminants as we would a pharmaceutical product that was made in a laboratory or manufactured in a plant, right? So it's a good to remember that these are wild things, but cannabis in itself, and the way it works in the dietary supplements federal regulations is that for each herb or each component or that you're going to use, you need to set a specification, and there's certain specs you need to set, and including for contaminants and adulterants. And it's up to the manufacturer, though, to assess the risk that you might have for each in particular herb, herbal material, component, or finished product. And for cannabis, there's some very specific risks because of some of the ways, especially that high THC cannabis is cultivated. So as Heather mentioned, there's this big variety of, very specific, generally microorganisms, yeast, mold, fungus, that are specific to and problematic with cannabis cultivation. So it is interesting that in some of the state medical systems, or just the state systems, whether it be medical or recreational use, contaminant testing is really mandated, and mandated at different levels across the supply chain. That's really quite more specific and intensive than or more prescriptive than federal regulations for botanical products in general. So in some ways, if you're buying cannabis products through your state systems, you can expect that they've been quite well tested for contaminants such as, especially the ones that are widely required among states, heavy metals, residual solvents, pesticides, and that kind of thing. So that's a good thing for the state systems and the dispensary products there, that there is quite rigorous and specific prescriptive contaminant testing, but again, differing per state. So it is true, Heather, what you just alluded to, that if you're in, Maryland, the products and things that are available to you there may have undergone a different level of rigor in terms of what different types of, say, pesticides are either allowed or are required to be tested for. So I'm not sure if that exactly answers your question, but I think the point being is that patients buying things in the state regulated systems have quite a good chance of coming across products that have been subjected to some pretty rigorous contaminant evaluation.
Mm-hmm. They have. And so some of the ways that the states enforce quality control is through laboratory sampling and testing. And so labs are tasked with identifying how the product should be tested and what is the best method of testing. And as you guys know, my background is in laboratory testing, and so this is kind of my big area. So the laboratories initially, before there were even any cannabis testing regulations, were kind of tasked with figuring out what are the most important things to even test for, what are people interested in. And realistically, most everybody was very interested in just potency testing. And it's only very recently that laboratories have started to become more required to test for contaminants. And this has been an evolution as the states have figured out what is the problems, what are any adverse events that may have been reported, what are the issues that patients and consumers may be seeing. And so one of the big ones, and if you look to our guide, we talk about some of the recalls and the different things that have happened, is the testing now has started to change, and the landscape is getting a bit more rigorous in that more states are getting on board with more rigorous testing requirements versus just simply requiring potency testing, which for a lot of CBD products, that's all that's being done for them. There are certainly producers who are going the lengths to get their products tested and provide accurate labeling. But what are some of the things, Holly, that you think consumers and patients should be aware of if they're looking for products how do they identify products that may have gone through a level of quality testing? And how do patients become more informed about product safety?
That's a great question, Heather. And I think, the guide that we're talking about here today is a great step forward to that, to kind of put some of this technical nuance into a way that's easier for patients to understand. I think one of the big things, when you talk about laboratory sampling and testing, the sampling in particular, I think even, many of the patients will also recognize that cannabis materials are kind of oily, right? They're lipophilic. And so oil and water separate. And so when you try to put cannabis extracts and things into foods and beverages, you can have some issues with homogeneity, and the bioactive compounds may not be distributed equally throughout the product. And I think that's one of the biggest issues, not only with, inconsistencies that patients might experience from buying the same given product, is due to this incomplete manufacturing or inattention to sampling when you're doing testing. So I think that's one of the key things, and I'm not sure how, exactly that gets resolved at a patient level. I think from a patient perspective, being able to ask the manufacturer, and I know that's not always possible in the context of dispensaries, but you can go look on the manufacturer's websites. Increasingly, they're pretty open about the products they are selling, even within their state, this type of thing. A lot of manufacturers have gone now towards displaying their certificates of analysis, as indicators of quality on their website. And so that's one good indication that a specific brand or manufacturer is really paying attention to their quality, whether it be in sampling or the types of contaminant tests that they're putting up. And you can imagine nobody's going to post a C of A on their website that says, "Ooh, our product failed for lead," right? So the fact that they're able to display those, you don't even, as a patient, you wouldn't need to be able to interpret the results necessarily and really dig in at a C of A level. But the fact that they're putting C of A's there can be somewhat of a relief, without having to go past kind of a layperson's understanding of interpreting the results. So I think that's a really good sign. It seemed very strange to me at first that companies were doing this, because you don't put up your analytical results of your peppermint or your turmeric products. But obviously there's some very specific and special things about cannabis and some special quality concerns. So that's usually a good sign if your manufacturer is being, again, it comes down to transparency. If they're willing to tell you what kind of things they tested for, even if the result just says conforms or pass, it's a really good indication that they're doing their due diligence in quality control and kind of QA protocols overall.
Thank you. And I think the information disclosure is really important. Our Patient's Guide to CBD actually goes into very great length and detail to explain how to kind of look at a certificate of analysis and understand it. And that takes us to kind of like some of the different requirements. Some states do require disclosure on their packaging and labeling to say what went into the cultivation process, what was used in the manufacturing process, what ingredients have gone into, say, food products, so that people have full transparency and information. And other manufacturers, where they're not necessarily required to, are making that information available on their website. And I think one of the best ways that patients can protect themselves is to really look at all of the information. Email the manufacturer. What's the worst they do? Tell you no, we're not going to give you that information. Maybe you move on to another manufacturer who is willing to provide that information to you, and have a level of transparency that says, we're committed to the quality of this product and we're willing to show you what we've done to make this product. But voluntary is all well and good. People used to voluntarily get their cannabis products tested. And now, as we move into more mandatory testing, we're starting to grapple with the differences between not only state and federal regulations, but also the differences amongst the states themselves. And so our guide really goes into depth about the different testing requirements that are at each level. But I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about kind of what do those differences mean for people who are purchasing a product in California versus Illinois versus Maryland, where they all have different testing requirements, they have different labeling requirements, and it's still different from what any sort of federal regulation would require as they determine their pathway for CBD products on the marketplace.
Yeah, Heather, I think this is one of the just coolest parts of this patient's guide that is just coming out. There's what I think is going to be a big table displayed, right, in the final version that will go through each different state. And it's not even just as complicated as, some states require this testing terpenes versus not, or even within the contaminants, different pesticide lists, that kind of thing. It really is even to the level of at different places in the supply chain. So, of course, you're going to be required to test for cannabinoids, THC, at least at a plant level and at a product level as well. And then there's certain states like California has 3 categories, and then different requirements for each of those categories. So the flower or inflorescence is one category, and then there's other inhalable products, vapes and concentrates, and then just other products, which encompasses a lot, right? That other category could be anything from your gummies, to soda waters, that kind of stuff, all the way to, topicals and that kind of stuff. I think all of that fits into that kind of other category. So even with 3 categories in one state, there's still some pretty broad categories with different product types in there. So it's kind of infinitely, maybe not infinitely, but quite complex when you start looking at this matrix of all the different states. So I think this is one of the key things that's going to be really helpful to patients in this patient's guide, is being able to go through, especially to specific patients that might be, say, immunocompromised or have, some other types of concerns, and they can look at, in my state, is this type of testing required? And I think that's going to be really useful, and also useful to other states as they, develop more states, join these types of systems and kind of develop their own regulations and requirements. And I think that's one of the biggest things, is that, as we've just been talking about, it is so complex when the different states have totally different requirements. So I think that's one great thing to come out of this particular patient's guide. And I think one other thing I'll mention, Heather and I are both lab nerds, and so there's not many people I can fireside chat about this stuff with, Heather. But testing is really, I mentioned different places in the supply chain. It really does come down to analytical methods too that are fit for purpose. And like I've talked with you about in the past, Heather, we've been on kind of a 5-7 year kind of rush to develop these methods that are specific to cannabis and hemp and their materials. And so obviously you're going to use a different method to prepare your sample when you have a brownie versus even a peanut butter cup versus a soda water, or a concentrate or a gummy bear, for that matter. So and especially with the contaminants. So that's been one of the big focus of kind of some of the standard setting bodies like AOAC that are trying to get really specific analytical methods that are now more kind of product focused, where you can be sure that you have a validated, accurate, and precise method that works on a gummy bear just as well as it works on a brownie or on a vape product. So we'll continue to develop those really fit for purpose methods, but it is complicated. And we both know people that have been, charging through this, and you and I, participating in some of these standards for specific methods. And so I think it is something to keep in mind for patients, that different states have different requirements. And in this patient's guide, you'll be able to kind of take a look at what the different levels of testing, especially for contaminants, that are required in your specific state.
Thank you. And I will add that one other thing that this patient guide will do is kind of give all of you patients and people out there who are wondering, how is this going to affect me? It's going to give you some information about how to talk to your regulator and how to go and get these changes made. If your state doesn't have the testing requirements that you need to do, then you want to get that put into action so that you have a mandatory testing and that patients are going to be safe. And so I think that's our time. We've been joined by a sleepy guest. But thank you guys for joining us. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out, put them in the chat, ask the questions. And if we can't get to them all right now, we will definitely answer them at some point. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Aloha.
Hey, everyone. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat for Holly and I. We're happy to answer questions about our upcoming guide, and we're looking forward to really giving everyone the information that they need to be an informed patient and an informed consumer, and have the tools needed to help get the changes made to get these states on track to start harmonizing the various regulations. It looks like we're not getting a whole lot of questions right now. So I don't know if Holly, you want to add anything or give anybody some more information and details?
Yeah, Heather, I do see a question here in the chat about from Ken asking, when will the patient's guide be available on the ASA website? And I know it's forthcoming, but I wonder if maybe you could talk a little bit more about not only this patient's guide, but kind of where it fits in the context and series of your other patient guides and how people can access those.
Sure. So I had mentioned earlier in the discussion about some of the guides and information that ASA currently has available, the ASA resources. And we have a number of resources out there that include our Patient's Guide to Contaminants that we just put out a couple of years, or Patient's Guide to CBD, sorry, that we just put out a couple of years ago, that goes into lengths to discuss the various CBD applications that people are looking at. And it also reviews how to read a certificate of analysis, how to talk to your doctor, and how to identify products that have been made safely and in manufacturing facilities that are trying to adhere to the highest quality standards. We also have a Patient's Guide to Medical Cannabis, our State of the States report, and our congressional briefing book that will be going out to this year's new Congress in a little bit. Our Patient's Guide to Contaminants, we are putting the final touches on it and should have that out in a few weeks.
That's great. So many good resources, Heather. Thanks for sharing that with everyone. I do see a couple other questions here that maybe we could chat about. One of them says, please share your ideas on acceptable levels of mold or mycotoxins in cannabis products. And, Heather, I feel like you're almost more of the expert when you want to compare that through kind of pan states. Maybe you could discuss a little bit mold and mycotoxins, and is it a required contaminant testing in all the states? And if so, are the levels the same?
So mold and mycotoxin testing are very tricky. There's a number of different ways that laboratories can test for these products, and cannabis is not the first commodity that requires this type of testing, especially for products that you're going to be inhaling. The United States Pharmacopoeia has chapters dedicated to pharmaceutical products, dietary supplements, non-pharmaceutical products, and then the different methods of delivery, such as inhalation or transdermal, oral, sublingual. And so one of the ways that regulators can really start to evaluate their state's regulations and whether or not they're up to snuff with what could happen in future potential federal regulations is seeing, are they lined up with what's currently out there? And, one of the challenges is that researchers haven't had the opportunity to research how these may affect people in the same way that other researchers for pharmaceutical products and dietary supplements have been able to research the health consequences of potentially consuming a contaminated product. And so we definitely want to make sure that we're pushing for greater boundaries for researchers to be able to study exactly what is going to happen to people, not just in the beneficial side, but also potentially as far as adverse events go, and encourage people to report adverse events, because some patients, especially that live in restrictive areas where maybe their access is limited or they're getting their medicines through alternative channels, they may be hesitant to report adverse events because there could be consequences for that. And so we want to make sure that there are not going to be consequences for patients that are reporting adverse events if they have consumed something that is going to be potentially toxic for them.
Heather, I'll just add on to that too. I love what you said at the beginning that, this isn't the only commodity or medicine that's ever, had to deal with yeast and molds. And we like to say over at APA, the American Herbal Products Association, that, cannabis, it's just another herb. As we know, it's not just another herb for many, many reasons, but we do have at APA a guidance document. It's free to the public and open on our page at apa.org, where we go over a total, we've got recommendations. It's a guidance document so that if you do decide, as in the case for cannabis or hemp, to set limits on molds, yeast and molds, and mycotoxins, we have some recommended limits that can be, set as your specifications when you're choosing your methods of analysis. And so we have a whole column for dried, unprocessed herbs that might be applicable to cannabis flowers, and then also for powdered extracts, soft extracts, and that kind of thing, more processed materials that have different limits, obviously. So yeah, we've got total yeast and molds and some mycotoxins and that kind of thing. So I think that hopefully these standards or these guidances that other organizations, especially like United States Pharmacopoeia, have set in their various standards, will be adopted by the states and hopefully uniformly, right?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the key things, is really that harmonization and the uniformness, because as a patient who may get their medicine when they're traveling to visit family from somewhere else that they're not sure of, their medicine may not meet the same quality standards that it would in their home state if they're used to having products be tested and understanding that if they're, some states are allowing the dispensaries to provide the certificates of analysis to patients ahead of time. Some of them, because they can't fit it all on a label, they're putting little QR codes on their packages so that people can have that information. And so we want to make sure that information is available to every patient and consumer, regardless of where they're located. And I think we are about a minute left into the questions. So if anyone has any more questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. And if we don't have time to get to all of the questions, we will definitely reach out afterwards and be available either in the chat or via email to get any remaining questions answered.
Yeah, I see one other additional comment here we might have time to just mention quickly, Heather, is someone asking about remediation. So if a lot or a batch fails for a contaminant, that might be different than it failing for, some other specification, right? And I think remediation, again, I'm not that familiar actually, and Heather, maybe you are, in terms of certain, I do know that certain states allow certain remediation steps for certain contaminants, but I think there's certain ones, or they allow them to go in a certain direction. But in many states, you just must destroy. So I'm not sure, that's a strange place to end, although we have been talking about contaminants. But Heather, maybe you have a parting comment on remediation and kind of the differences again throughout the states. Is that something we have to be aware of?
It is. Some states do not allow remediation. So remediation, for those who aren't aware, or reprocessing or reworking, is when a product fails a test and a state allows you to reprocess it, rework it, transform it into something that will pass the testing. And one of the big issues is that you can't remediate pesticides and heavy metals. There's just no way around it. Once it's in there, even if you're making a concentrate, you're just concentrating those heavy metals. And at this point, there's not technology to get those removed. And so those products have to be destroyed. For things like microbial contamination or residual solvents, there are some ways that you can remediate those. For instance, residual solvents, you can just continue to process it and try and purge any of those solvents out and get it to a level where it's safe for consumption. For microbials, I think the science is really trying to help show that there are processing ways, such as like CO2 extraction, where you're pushing these aerobic microbials into an anaerobic environment and ideally hoping that during the concentration making process, they die off. And so there are some states that will allow reprocessing of failed flower materials to be made into concentrates, and some states that just force you to dispose of your entire product and your entire batch if it fails that. And so you should be aware of what the requirements are in your state for testing and make sure that your products are meeting a requirement that you feel safe and comfortable with consuming them.
Awesome. I see there's some other questions in the chat, but I think sadly we're out of time. And so it's been so great to talk with you all. And I'm going to be at the event the rest of the day. So, if anyone wants to send an email or we can chat in the chat. It's been a pleasure.
Perfect. Thanks, Holly.